Continuing with Book 3, Chapter 27, verse 32. In the intelligent soul, it is consciousness alone that shines in the form of the world, and not any material body that was never brought into being. Like waves in a lake rise and sit and rise again, so the rising and falling days and nights present these various scenes to our knowledge. Leela said, "So it is, O Mother of mankind. I come to remember now that my previous birth is of a royal kind, neither too pure nor gross in nature. I have descended from Brahman, having undergone 108 births, and after passing various states, I find myself still in existence. I recollect, O Goddess, that I was born before in another world, that I was the bride of a demigod, Vidyadhara, and used to wander about as freely as a bee over flowers. Being debased by my lack of moral restraint, I was born in this mortal world and became the mate of the king of the eagle-feathered tribe. Having lived in the woods, then I was turned into a woodsman's mate, wearing a garment of leaves on my loins. Growing fond of my life, I played wantonly about the forest and was changed into a kuluncha plant, delighting the woods with my leafy palms and flowering eyes. This small tree in a holy hermitage was held sacred by a group of saintly sages. Then, after the woods were burnt down by a wildfire, I was regenerated into the form of a hermit's child. Here I was taught the formulas for removing the curse of womanhood, and I became a male in the person of the handsome prince of the land of Surat, where I reigned for 100 years. Then, on account of my misconduct in the government, I was denounced to become a weasel, covered with leprosy, living in the lowlands of Tali. I remember, O Goddess, how I became a bullock in Surat, and how for full 8 years I was goaded by thoughtless cowherd children in their merry sport. I have in mind that when I was transformed into a bird, with that difficulty I broke the net that was laid by bird catchers for my destruction. It was in the same manner as we released ourselves from the snares of sinful desires. I remember with pleasure when, as a bee, I landed lightly on the leaflets of blossoms, sipped the honey of the blooming buds, dined on the pistils, and slept in the cups of lotus flowers. In the form of an antelope, I wandered about in pleasant woodlands and lawns with my exalted and branching horns and beautiful eyes, until I was killed by a hunter's arrow. I have been in the form of a fish, and I was lifted up by the waves of the sea above the surface of the water. I saw how a tortoise was killed by the blow of a club on the neck. I was a tribal Chandala outcast, hunter once, wandering by the side of the Charmanvati Chenab River. When tired of roaming, I used to quench my thirst with coconut water. I also became a stork, delighting in lakes with my mate, filling the air with their sweet voices. In another birth, I rambled about in groves of palm and tamara trees, and fixed my eyes with amorous looks and glances upon my lover. Next, I was a fairy apsara, with a form as bright as melted gold, and features as beautiful as those of the lotus and lily, in which the celestials used to take delight like bees and butterflies. I remember being on earth, having decked myself in gold, pearls, rubies, and other gems, and playing with my youthful consorts in pleasure gardens, in groves, on hills and mountains. I also remember living long as a tortoise on the borders of a river, and to have been carried away by the waves, sometimes under a tree of vines overhung with clusters of beautiful flowers, sometimes washed by waves into some wild cave. I see how I acted the part of a goose, covered by feathers, swimming on the high heaving waves on the surface of a lake. Then seeing a poor gnat hanging on the moving leaf of a cotton tree, Somali branch, I became its associate, and as contemptible a thing as itself. I became an aquatic crane, also, skimming playfully over the waters gushing from hills, lightly kissing the crests of waves rising over the rapid torrent. I remember also how I slighted the loves of amorous youths and spurned the lesser demigod Vijayadhara children on the Gandhamandana and Mandara hill. I remember likewise the pangs of a lovelorn lass as I lay pining in my bed strewn with the fragrance of camphor, and how I was decaying like the disk of the waning moon. Thus I passed through many births in the wombs of higher and lower animals, and found them all to be full of pain. My soul was run over the waves of the irresistible current of life, like a fleet of antelope pacing its speed with the swiftness of the wind. Chapter 28. Leela's Vision in Meditation. Description of the mountain hamlet. Ram said, "Tell me, sage, how did the goddesses break out of the strongholds of their bodies and the prison house of this world and pass through infinite space and survey the scenes beyond its confines. Vashishta replied, "Where is the world and where is its support or solidity?" They were all situated in the region within the minds of the goddesses. In their minds, they saw the hilly tract where the Brahman Vashishta lived and had his desire for royalty. They saw his deserted house, and in their minds, they saw the surface of the earth stretching to the sea. In that imaginary spot of earth, they saw the city of the king and the royal palace, which he had worshipped with Arundhati, his wife. They saw how she was born under the name of Leela, and how she worshipped the goddess of wisdom, Saraswati, by whom she was miraculously conveyed to the delightful region of the sky. It was in the house situated in that hilly village that she saw the world placed within the space of her mind. Having come out of her vision of the world, she found herself sitting in her house, just like one finds himself lying in his own bed after rambling from one dream to another. All that she saw was mere vision and void. There was no world, no earth, no house, and no distance. It was the mind that showed them these images. Just like the mind presents the objects of our desire to our view. Otherwise, there is neither world nor earth in actuality. The sphere of consciousness is infinite and without any covering. If agitated by the powers of one's intellect, it presents all the objects of nature to his view, like the sky when agitated by heat produces the winds. The sphere of consciousness is uncreated. It is ever calm everywhere. Deluded minds suppose the world to exist. He who understands rightly sees the world as an unsubstantial as air. But whoever is misled by wrong judgment takes it to be like a solid mountain. As a house and city are manifested to us in our dream, so this unreal world is presented as a reality to our understanding. It is like the misconception of water in the mirage and the mistake of gold in a bracelet. All this reality appears as a reality to the mistaken mind. Discoursing in this manner between themselves, the two charming ladies walked out of the house with their graceful steps. Being unseen by the village people, they viewed the mountain standing before them, kissing the vault of heaven and touching the orb of the sun with its lofty peaks. It was decorated with flowers of various colors and covered with a variety of trees of various colors. There were waterfalls, gushing in their tremendous roaring on one side, and groves resounding with the warbling of birds in another. The clouds were variegated by many colored clusters of flowers sweeping over them, and cranes and storks sat screeching on the cloud-capped tops of kuluncha trees. There were robust reeds lining the banks of rivers with their wide-stretching stems and roots. Strong winds tossed the tender vines growing out of the rocky caves. Clouds from the vault of heaven hung over the tops of trees, covered with flowers, and shed their pearly drops of rainwater profusely upon them, forming streams below. The banks of the streamlets were continually lapped by waves, raised by winds playing upon the shaking trees. Branches spread a cooling shade all around. Standing on that spot, the ladies saw the hilly hamlet in the grass, like a fragment of heaven had fallen on the ground. There the rippling streams softly glided by, and here the brimming brooks wobbled in the ground. The birds of the air chirped on the sprays, and aquatic fowls flew about the holes of the seashore. There they saw herds of cattle, slowly moving and grazing in the plains, filling the echoing woods with their loud lowing. They saw an open space broken with shady groves and trees and green meadows all about. Their cliffs were white with snow, impenetrable by sunbeams. Hilltops were covered with bushy brambles, forming like braids of hair upon their craggy heads. Cascades falling in torrents in the cavities of rocks scattered their pearly particles afar, like the churning of the milky ocean by Mandara Mountain. The trees in the glens, loaded as they were with their fruit and flowers, appeared like waiters upon the goddesses, standing to welcome their approach with their rich presence. Shaken by gusts of roaring winds, the forest trees were shedding showers of their honey-sweetened flowers as offering to the woodland gods and people. The birds that approach fearlessly to drink the water from the hill now fled for fear, because the water seemed like sleet, or the shells and shots of archers. Birds, parched by thirst and wishing to drink the water, dashed by the waves of the rivulet, hovered upon it like stars in the sky. There were rows of crows sitting on the tops of tall palm trees, from whose sight children were hiding the remains of their sweetmeat. They saw country lads with garlands of flowers on their heads and garments roaming in the cooling shades of the date, jam, and neem trees. They saw a lean and hungry beggar woman passing by slowly, clad in cloth of flax, with garlands of blossoms over her ears. They saw lazy rustics lying in their lonely retreats, talking away from the noisy brooks where they could barely hear one another. They saw naked beggar children crowding in a compound, curd smeared on their faces and hands, cow dung on their bodies, and holding flowery branches of plants in their hands. On the green river banks, waves shook bushes as if there were a swing, leaving their marks on the sandy shore as the waters receded to their bed. There was a house full of flies, attracted by sweet milk and curds. But children were crying for lack of food. Herdswomen were fretting at seeing their bracelets daubed by cow dung they were spreading to dry. Men were smiling at seeing the eagerness of women tying the loosened knots of her hair. Crows from the hilltops were alighting to pick up the offerings of the holy sages, and paths around their houses were strewn with sacred kuru and kurunta leaves. Every morning, flowering plants growing in the caves of the hills and around the house covered the ground heel deep with heaps of flowers. There were the whisk-tailed cattle and antelope grazing in one part of the forest, and tender young deer sleeping on beds of grass under kunja groves. There were young calves lying on their sides, shaking their ears to drive away the flies that fluttered around their faces, milk dripping from the sides of their mouths. Rooms stored honey collected by driving bees from their hives. Gardens were full of flowering ashokas. Rooms were painted with red dye. Winds, moistened by rain showers, had brought the garden of trees to bloom, and yellow kadamba buds hung like a canopy over the bed of green grass below. Ketaka tree grove was blooming white from having its weeds removed, and the watercourse glided along with its soft murmuring tune. Winds whistled in the windows of caves, and clouds rested on mountain tops. Ponds were brimful of water, covered with lotus, like so many moons. A grove of green trees cast its cooling and undivided shade upon the ground, where dewdrops trembled on blades of grass and glistened like twinkling stars in the blue sky. Trees constantly dropped their ripened fruit, dried flowers, and leaves of various sorts, like showers of snow on whitened ground. Some clouds were seen to hang continually over the household compound, like aristocratic girls who were never forsake their parents' home. Other clouds hovered over the roof of the houses, flashing lightning to supply the light. The altar here reverberated to the loud roaring of winds, confined in the caves of mountains. The temple there was graced by twittering swallows and parrots that perched upon it from their numerous flights. Soft breezes moved slowly as they passed along the lawn, loaded with fragrance, exhaled by sleepy flowers and gently shaking the leaves of trees. There the ladies listened to prattling and playful parrots and partridges, and here they heard the melodious notes of the kokila nightingale, calling back to the jarring crows on the branches. Palm and tamara trees were loaded with fruit, and the forest trees were entwined with vines that waved their leafy palms around them. There were tender ivy vines clasping the branches on one side, and the fragrance of effervescent candala and cylindra plants exhaled on the other. Tapering palm and tamara trees rose as high as spires, and a cooling breeze was blowing amidst the flowering plants in the garden. There were cattle hastening to drink water in troughs, and garden trees hung with loads of green unripe fruit and beautiful flowers. Running streams were hidden under rows of trees by their banks. Stalks of plants were studded with flowers. Gardens were perfumed with the nectar fragrance of kunda flowers, and lakes were redolent with the odor of lotuses, hiding bumblebees, giddy with the liquor of their honey cells. The air was reddened with rose-colored pollen, flying from crimson lotuses. as if mocking the redness of Indra's palace in the sky. The scene was enchanted with the gurgling noise of small rivers running precipitously down from the hills, kundu flowers as white as clouds hanging over them. The beauty of the flower gardens around the house and the musical warbling of songbirds singing joyfully in the air. Boys were sporting on the beds of flowers, and playful maidens were decked with flowery wreaths hanging down to their feet. Everywhere the ground was adorned with sprouting and prickly shrubs and blades of grass. There was a beauty displayed in the clasping of vines about the clumps of reeds. New shooting buds and blossoms covered the trees, and fragments of clouds shrouded the houses below. The ground was decorated by wreaths of icicles, and the flashing of lightning in the clouds over the houses terrified the women within. There was a sweet fragrance of blue lotuses and the hoarse lowing of the cattle hurrying to their green grazing ground. Confident deer and does were lying tamely in the yard, and peacocks danced merrily before waterfalls, as if there were showers of rainwater. Fragrant breezes were blowing giddily with the flavors of the fragrances they bore. Medicinal plants were lending their lights like lamps at night. Bird nests resounded with ceaseless warbling, and the noise of waterfalls deepened the ears of men on the bank. Early dewdrops continually falling on the ground from the leaves of trees and blades of grass. The gleaming beauty of the ever-blooming blossoms above, and the other everlasting charms of mountain hamlets baffle the description of poets. So what is being presented here is quite interesting. Just following the statement that everything does not exist. Nothing exists. All is illusion. Is this marvelous chapter on the description of the illusion? Why? Why give a huge description of an illusion? Well, it's to remind us of our own memories of illusions. As we're reading this, we're carried away by the poetic beauty of all the various aspects. And this brings up memories in our mind, doesn't it? What were you thinking as I was reading this? You're having memories of various things. You're having memories of fragrant breezes, medicinal plants, icicles, all kinds of things were sparking memories. And why is this done? Because memories are directly connected. They are, in fact, karmic traces. And when we bring a karmic trace into awareness, while we are witnessing from the silent witness, what happens? That karmic trace vanishes. It just dissipates. It dissipates in the brilliance and the light and the clarity of the silent witness, like smoke rising over a smoldering log. It just vanishes in the air. And so this reading is a wonderful blessing, bringing up so many hundreds of karmic traces to be melted in the Param Jyoti. Param Jyoti, is the effulgence of Krishna. It surrounds our universe like sunlight surrounding a bubble floating in the air, glistening and illuminating the interior of the bubble. And the silent witness is our direct connection to Param Jyoti. Param Jyoti, the light of this beautiful effulgence of Krishna, shows how everything is an illusion. Chapter 29. Description of Leela's life as Arundhati. Description of astral travel in space. Vasishta speaking. Then the two goddesses sat on a cooling village seat. Much like the two sides of joy and liberation meet in the tranquil spirit of the man knowing the divine spirit. Well, that's a pretty incredible statement, isn't it? Like the two states of joy and liberation meet in the tranquil spirit of the man knowing the divine spirit. By this time, Leela had become personified in the form of pure consciousness through her knowledge of meditation. She had become a seer of the three times presenting themselves before her. She remembered the whole course of her past life and derived pleasure relating the events of her former life and death. Now, why would she derive pleasure from relating the events of her former life and death? When we remember, like Leela did, the whole course of our lives, our past lives, it puts us into a wonderful perspective of being able to see, it was all illusion. And now, as I remember all this illusion, it is vanishing. It's like looking at a mirage in the desert. And you see this shimmering pool that looks like water. But you remember, no, there can't be a lake over there. This is a desert. And you just shift your perspective a little bit, the lake disappears. The shimmering water turns into dull sand. Shift your perspective again, oh, there's the mirage again. There's some satisfaction in proving to the ego that there's an illusion. And pleasure is the result of that, because as we step outside of the illusion, we're in the eternal, unmitigated bliss of the silent witness. And that radiating bliss is experienced as pleasure. Leela said, "By your favor, O goddess, and by sight of this place, I recollect all that I did and thought of in my past life. Here I grew up to old age, and here I withered and become lean and thin as a skeleton. I was a Brahmin here and had my body scratched by dry sacrificial grass, kusha. I was the legal wife of my lord and producer of his race. I was employed milking cattle and churning curd. I had been mother of many sons and a kind hostess to my guests. I was devoted to the service of the gods and Brahmins and good people, and rubbed my body with cow milk and ghee. I cleaned the frying pans and boiling kettles of the house. I boiled food daily with a single bracelet of glass and one of conch shell on my wrist. I served my father, mother, brother, daughters, and sons-in-law with their daily meals, working all day and night. My body was emaciated like that of a domestic servant. Haste and hasten were the words I used to repeat to myself. Being so busy, I was silly and ignorant. Although I was the wife of a Brahmin, I never wondered, not even in a dream, about what I was and what was this world. Fully engaged in the collection of fuel, cow dung, and sacrificial wood and vegetables, I became emaciated in my body, which was wrapped in a worn-out blanket.